policing with safety, because we know actually that police don't prevent crime, they respond to crime. We also know that even then, they're only effective at 4% of actually solving crime. So we need to actually institute a community first responders department that would provide trained and skilled people who can provide intervention and de-escalation in instances of homelessness, of mental health, of substance abuse. And we need to connect those people in crisis to the larger ecosystem of human service providers, medical providers, mental health providers, so that they are getting the help that they need so we can break this cycle. That is the way for us to move forward in solidarity and taking care of each other as neighbors in New York City.
And Ms. Morales, I'm a lifelong New Yorker, and I have an Asian American. I have to say, my brother and I had a conversation recently about having our mother and the fears of having our mother go out by herself. Yeah. How would you, specifically when it comes to the Asian American community, how would you assuage their fears about simple thing like going down the street to buy groceries?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the fears are warranted. There has been a demonstrable increase. But I also don't believe that the criminalization, that the way for us to deal with this is through policing, because I don't think that police have actually, we haven't reduced the number of police on our streets over the last year. In fact, we've increased their presence in the subway, and that has not correlated to an increase in violence. So we have to rely on other community strengths and other community partners to keep each other safe during this critical time. And we also need to plan for a future where we're not relying on a resource that has already failed us so tremendously.
Okay, thank you so much. And now let me send it on over to Mr. McGuire. How would you as mayor address the hate incidents in the Asian American?
I'm heavily influenced by the words of the great Martin Luther King Jr., who says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're tied in an inescapable garment of destiny. What affects one of us affects all of us. The first thing I would do as mayor is to stand up and denounce the anti-Asian hatred that we're now seeing today. We need to have a leader who says this is not that for which we stand. Number one. Number two, I would invest in the anti-Asian or the anti-hate crimes unit. I want better policing. I'd invest in the anti-hate crimes unit. And as you says, when our mothers go out into the streets in fear for their physical safety, one of the things that gives them comfort is the fact that they see people there who do have the authority of the police, who give them comfort that it's going to be okay. So I would make sure that I had better policing and those who are there to protect, at least give them comfort of protection. I will also invest in the community-based organizations that can serve as those who can give the mental health support that's necessary in order for those who suffer from the hate to get the resources that they need. So yes, in order to protect our mothers and give them confidence, we need to have a visible show of that which stands for right.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Let's move on to our next question. We're going to dive a little deeper into this topic. What role will you play as mayor in terms of building solidarity between Asian American communities and other marginalized groups to dismantle systemic racism? You'll have a minute each to respond. We'll start with Mr. McGuire. Mr. McGuire.
I have a lifelong, at least a career long, if not a lifelong experience with bringing different communities together. As a 6'4", 200-pound Black man, having to navigate a world where the vast majority of people did not look like me, and having run a global business where I have existed and led in communities around the world, including in specific in the Asian communities around the world, I know how it is to bring people from different backgrounds and different demographics, from different economic backgrounds together, because I've had to do that in order to lead a business, especially in the depth of the crisis. And not only have I led businesses, I've led organizations that are diverse, multicultural organizations whose focus was to make sure that they were inclusive, that every member of the community was included. And I've also made sure that those leaders who were on my team reflected the rich mosaic of this city, including the Asian community. So I have a track record of having been inclusive in bringing communities together.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wiley, I'll have you weigh in now.
Well, thank you. You know, I have spent my entire adult life fighting to end structural racism. In fact, when I created my not-for-profit organization called the Center for Social Inclusion, after September 11th, with a baby in a bouncy seat, our explicit mission was to end it. That's what we said before others were talking about structural racism. But 9/11 was the perfect example of what structural racism is, which is when $21 billion was coming into New York City to help us recover from the crisis. Chinatown and the Lower East Side were cut out of the catchment area. That's what I call structural racism. So a big part of being mayor and a big part of what is in all of my plans, which are at MayaWileyforMayor.com, is about how we reverse that and actually invest in communities of color so that communities of color are getting what they need, but also have a voice at the table. So one of the ways I worked with the School Diversity Advisory Group, for instance, on integrating our public schools, we had all the stakeholders at the table. It was a diverse group. It included parents and students, advocates, academics, educators, and we went into every single borough, met with 800 different people to discuss what it would mean to have an excellent and integrated education. And the way I will work as mayor is as someone who listens and learns and leads in partnership by pulling those tables together. But at the end of the day, it's about using the power of the office to actually invest in communities that have been disinvested in.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to go over to Mr. Chang.
The leader of a city that has a budget which is bigger than all but 4 states and a workforce that would be the 13th largest corporation in the country if it were a private corporation has immense power. And one of those powers is to convene a conversation among all the different parties and bring people together, working from the bottom up. We have a unique opportunity right now because of the sort of historical context of the Asian community. Asian immigration was illegal until 1965. So Asian immigration has really been late to the game. And adding to that complexity is the fact that there are people from so many different countries and so many different languages. So only now are people beginning to cohere. So we have so much to learn from the experience of the Black community with the civil rights and Black Lives Matter, from the Latinx community, and then also from the Jewish community fighting anti-Semitism. So we can leverage that knowledge, but we all recognize that it's not enough, that what we have done so far isn't working, and we need to take it to the next level, and we can all do that together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now to Ms. Morales, what role will you play as mayor in building solidarity between Asian American communities and other marginalized groups to dismantle systemic racism?
Sure. You know, I think first of all, we've got to recognize actually the rich history of the Asian American community in solidarity with other BIPOC communities and marginalized groups. You know, the API community is also incredibly diverse, and Black and Brown Asians exist. I think it's important for us to recognize how white supremacy has often created a wedge between the API community and the Black and Brown communities in pitting one another against each other. The model minority myth actually harms all of the diverse API communities because it actually furthers that wedge. We need to actually build a diverse, multiracial coalition that works towards solidarity across all of our marginalized groups. I've done this already on my campaign leadership team that is women of color led with strong API representation. We need to approach public policy with a lens that is focused on dismantling systemic racism. And that includes things like desegregating our schools and defunding the police. Actually, and critically, we need to make sure that our marginalized communities do not continue to allow themselves to be pitted against each other in fighting for scraps, whether in the city budget or other critical city resources. And we can build that solidarity together when we provide the resources that our communities need.
Okay, let's move on. We have one more 1-minute question for each of you. Same topic, I should say. Asian Americans have been 2 times more likely to test positive for COVID-19 than their white counterparts, yet less likely to be tested at all. Asian American communities have taken a huge hit during this pandemic. The joblessness rate is 25.6%. That is the largest increase of any major racial group in New York City. A lot of members of our community tend to go to the community-based organizations first for help, but they've been historically underfunded by the city. We touched upon this earlier. I want to dive a little deeper now, and I'll start with Ms. Wiley. Given competing city budget priorities, how will you ensure equitable funding to sustain these organizations to address the needs of our Asian American communities?
Yeah, look, a big part of it is by using a lens where we're actually looking at the dollars in need and being very explicit that the dollars have to go and feed and seed the ground in communities that have been hit hardest by COVID. And on the city side, in terms of, for example, human service procurement and contracting, a big part of that is to change how we're doing it. Creating the table with all the groups that are underrepresented in city contracting for human services, and actually saying how we flip that script. A big part of it is that the dollars typically go to the biggest players who typically aren't the community-based human service providers. That's a problem for language access, as well as the kind of culturally responsive care and support and the relationships and trust. So what I'm going to actually do is make that mandatory agenda for the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, which is the office that figures that out, and really commit the money, including to the administrative costs required, to make sure we are investing fairly and justly to reach all our people. As I said in the beginning on the values, and also in terms of the way we look at comeback, we don't come back as a city that we love unless every single one of us comes back. And that includes the Asian and Pacific Islander community.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to Mr. Chang. How will you make sure these community-based organizations are fairly funded to help the Asian American communities?
So the data you provided was true before COVID, right? And the unemployment rate has actually increased further. We also know that the poverty rate in our community is the highest of any ethnic group in New York City. We know that we make the lowest weekly wage. wages. We know that the loss of employment during COVID was the worst of any community. So we know all this data, but yet the data isn't being used. So what I would do as mayor is to actually create a system where we look at all the data. We look at because this applies to every single group. What data do we have? How does it align? How does our funding actually align to that data? And we can actually start seeing, are we being fair? Are we being equitable? Are we having equality in how the city begins to distribute its money? Because then I can make decisions instead of on emotion. I can make decisions based upon what the reality is on the ground and ensure that the right groups are being funded.
Okay, and now to Mr. McGuire, I'll have you weigh in on this topic.
Yeah, one of the threshold things, one of the first things that we need is somebody who understands how to manage budgets. Those who've been in office up to this point didn't have any familiarity with, no experience with, no judgment. And if we continue with the same thing, the impact that it has on this community is going to be that much worse. We've seen the conditions that exist pre-COVID. They've gotten exacerbated by COVID. Unless we have somebody who comes in who understands how to manage budgets and how to prioritize and how to build so that the Asian American community will be included, we're going to meet with the same statistics, if not worse. My plan is the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback plan in the history of this city, which by design in my budget will include this community, especially the small businesses that are the heart of this community, and making sure that we get the resources there. That is included in my greatest, most inclusive economic comeback plan at rayformayor.com. I've done this before. I know how to lead and manage budgets more than anybody else in this entire race. I know how to do that and be held accountable for that budget, which is what I would do as I move this budget forward and as I lead this city forward to be inclusive.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Now to Ms. Morales, how will you address the economic and financial needs of these organizations?
Sure. So I'm actually the only candidate in this race that has spent decades at the helm of these kinds of organizations where you get reimbursed 80 cents on the dollar. And I have a history and a track record not only of closing that gap, but of also effectively growing the organization and providing quality services. The reality of it is that our API community-based organizations receive less than 1% of all city contract dollars, despite the fact that the API community represents over 15% of our population. That is highly problematic. Community-based organizations are a critical part of my platform. I believe that they have trust in the communities. They speak the languages of our communities and are reflective of the communities that they serve. And they know how to approach, from a culturally competent perspective, they know how to approach care and service provision in these communities. So I am committed to actually investing in CBOs to help actually move us forward from this